Hello again. This is Rob Wagner with Microsoft, and today I wanted to spend a few minutes and talk about Hyper-V Replication. So Hyper-V Replica is a new capability in Windows Server 2012, and I want to walk you through how you set it up and then some basic replication. I'm only going to deal with 2 Hyper-V servers today, not a Windows cluster. I'll have another session that'll cover the Windows cluster. The first thing we need to do is configure our Hyper-V servers for replication. Under Hyper-V settings for each of my servers, I need to go down to Replication Configuration and enable replication. I can use Kerberos and HTTP unencrypted for my replication, or I could use a certificate-based replication over port 443 HTTPS, and it'll even let me select the certificate I want to use. I haven't installed a certificate on this server for replication, so I get this error that tells me what kind of certificate I need to enable replication. So I will disable this and I will use Kerberos. Now the other thing I configure here as well is who can I replicate with? Can I allow replication from any authenticated server, or do I only want to allow replication from specified servers? So now this top piece of the configuration is configuring this server as a sender of a replica. The bottom half is how do I configure this server as a recipient of a replica. So I'm going to allow replicate from any server, and then I'm also going to specify the directory that I want my replicas to be stored in. Later, we'll actually replicate back to this server, but for now, I'll go ahead and configure this. It reminds us that we need to make sure our firewall is open. I've already taken care of that. And so now that's the first server to replicate away from. I'm going to replicate to my server H2. So now I go over to H2 and basically do the same things. I'm going to go ahead and enable it as a replica server, although this is just going to be the recipient. So the bottom half is what we're looking for. So I say allow replication from any authenticated server, and again, point it to my designated location. Get the reminder of the firewall again. And so we're done. So now what I've been able to do is take this virtual machine, and let me show it to you real quick. As you can see, it has just a standard Windows 7 desktop, and it's up and running. So now to enable replication, I right-click on the virtual machine and say Enable Replication. I'll define my replica server, which will be H2. I can browse my directory or just type in the server name. Specify my connections. Since I've only set this up for Kerberos and have it install a certificate, it won't let me choose certificate-based authentication, which is fine. That's all we're going to use. I can compress the data over the network or not. The question here comes down to, do I want to use the CPU to compress data or save CPU and sacrifice bandwidth? Choose the replication virtual hard drives. This virtual machine actually has 2 virtual hard drives. They're located here. And so I'm going to choose to replicate both of them. And then from a recovery history, how many replicas do I want to keep? This is where it gets interesting because I can keep additional recovery points. Let's say I want to keep 5 recovery points. And then let's say I want to replicate incremental VSS every few hours. What this means is that when we do a typical replication, it will replicate just a snapshot of what's on the disk. Think about a Hyper-V snapshot, and then we replicate those deltas. VSS means we're going to quiesce that virtual machine. From a user perspective, they don't see the impact of VSS because it happens quickly. But what it basically does is says, if this is an Exchange server or a SQL server, let's tell those that we're about to snapshot them. And this is how I can designate how often that will happen. Now keep in mind, if I'm going to snapshot a SQL server or an Exchange server, there may be a delay while that happens. But SQL and Exchange are both smart enough to cache that I/O. So again, from the user's perspective, they won't see it. But for this example, I'll say every hour I want you to quiesce this. Hyper-V Replica moves this snapshot every 5 minutes. So every 5 minutes it'll take a snapshot. Once an hour, it will quiesce that virtual machine and then take a snapshot and move that. And then I can choose the initial replication method. So I could send this initial copy over the network, which is what I'm going to do in this scenario because I'm talking about 12 gigs. Or I could copy this replica to external media. Let's say we're at a remote site. I could do the initial replication, copy it to remote media, bring it back to my centralized site, import that media, and then enable replication. Now it's only moving deltas. And then when do I want to start replication? Maybe I want to set up replication, but I don't want it to start. I don't want that first replication to occur until at night. And that way I can have better control over my bandwidth consumption. It'll give me a quick summary. I hit finish and it'll start replication. Now that we've enabled replication, we don't really see a big difference yet. If we look over at status, it'll tell us it's sending the initial replica. If we move over to the server we're sending it to, I now have this VM named the same thing, but also notice that the state is off. So with Hyper-V Replica, we're now moving a replica of that virtual machine from one host to the other. The copy of my virtual machine stays off through this whole experience. If it were to be turned on, then I would have two virtual machines of the same name, and that would create all sorts of problems. But Hyper-V Replica is set up so that it will create a replica every 5 minutes. It changes over to the destination. And that way, if we have some catastrophe with the host server, we have a copy that's at most 5 minutes behind real time. Now keep in mind, when I say it replicates every 5 minutes, then the question is, how long does that delta take to get to the destination? On a WAN experience, it might take longer to move these deltas. So that's something you need to plan for. With Hyper-V Replica, I should easily be able to get back to a 15-minute window of when my outage occurred. What I'm going to do is pause for a few minutes and let this replication happen, and I'll come back to you once the virtual machine's been able to replicate. So the initial replication has completed. We're back on server H2, which is where we're storing the replica, and you can see initial replica, and then you can see now. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and move back to this virtual machine and connect to it. And let's make a change so that we can see things actually changed. And of course I want to do something obvious, right? So let's just change our desktop background. How about a good sunset background? We'll go ahead and close our window. And so there's our sunset background. So what this will do is the next time it replicates, we'll be able to see that the new background replicated. I could also go here, and since I created 2 drives, I have this file, test replication. But let's go ahead and put some changes in this. Go ahead and save this. And again, next time this virtual machine replicates, we'll be able to see that. I'll go ahead and close this window. Now the other thing we can do is, remember we're looking at the running virtual machine. How do I know this replica of the virtual machine is actually usable? I could check on the status of this virtual machine. When we look at replication now, we have some other options. I could fail over and force a failover from one host to the other. We'll talk about that more in a minute. I could pause replication. I could view replication health. So replication health tells me the last time that we replicated and where we currently stand. The other thing I can do here, the option I skipped over, was test failover. So what test failover lets me do is actually see this virtual machine run. So I can go look at my recovery points, the original or the most current, and I could say test failover. So what it's actually going to do is create a new snapshot of a virtual machine for me. And as you could see, it created this new virtual machine named test, and we can actually fire that up. And the reason we can fire that up is because when we test failover, it automatically disconnects the network. So keep that in mind. We don't want to ever test failover with that virtual machine having visibility to the network, or we'll have the same virtual machine show up twice and that'll be an issue. So now we can start this virtual machine, and as you'll see, because this image of the OS wasn't shut down properly, we get this Windows warning. We can just say start Windows normally, and we'll wait for it to start up. Now that this virtual machine is up and running, as you can see, it has our new background because another replica occurred. I can actually look at both of these VMs. You can tell the difference between them because of the name on the title bar. Win7ent x86 on H1, Win7ent x86-test on H2. Now the other great part is I went and brought the most recent snapshot. I could have asked for a prior snapshot. So here, I could go ahead and turn off this virtual machine. Again, let's confirm we're on H2 and we're talking to the replica. We can just turn it off, because once we turn this off and then delete it, because remember, this was a snapshot of our replica, so this is disposable. So we'll go ahead and delete this, and then the deletion will go ahead and clean up that snapshot it created and all those other settings for us. Let's say we want to do a failover of this Win7 Ent x86 virtual machine. So here's the replica of it. On either one of these, we can say failover. Notice we're saying failover.test failover. So we're saying failover because we lost the original host or we want to move the virtual machine. When we say failover, it asks us again which recovery point. And so I could say the most recent and go failover. And notice that it gives me an error. I can't do a failover when the original virtual machine is still running. So I have to go turn that off first. So I could go here and say shut down so that we do an orderly shutdown. So now that I have the original off, I want to go ahead and say planned failover because we're planning to do this. And I have a checklist. It'll start the virtual machine after the failover checklist. So I can kick off a failover one of two ways. I can go to the replica virtual machine and say failover and choose replication and failover, and it can let me choose from the last recovery point. But since this is a planned failover, if we go to the original virtual machine, I can now say replication planned failover. And so now I can say this is a planned failover, not a disaster, and we actually have a planned failover checklist. Check the virtual machine is off. Check that there's a configuration to allow to reverse replication again. So again, this way I can now change replica, which host I'm replicating to, and then it'll make sure the data is moved. So I can say failover, it'll run through its checklist, it'll replicate any data that hasn't been replicated so far, it'll reverse the replication, and then start that virtual machine. And so now it shows that failover completed successfully. And so now when we move back over to this virtual machine, remember this was our replica, and we move back over to this, we see this virtual machine is now starting up. And it has a clean startup since we were able to replicate all of those last changes. So this lets me actually reverse my replication configuration. While that comes up, let me show you. So we're looking at H2, which is now the host Hyper-V server. H1 now becomes the replica Hyper-V server. So it's off. And we're now doing replications. I can check on replication health again, and there it shows that replication's enabled. Notice that it hasn't had to replicate yet because it already sent its replica over. Keep in mind when we do this, we lose all those old replica snapshots. But now we can flip over to this virtual machine and see that it's just as current as we left it, even in our file. With that, I'd like to thank you for your time, and I hope you have a good day.